I remember that day as if it was yesterday. It was right before the Passover. The Feast of Unleavened Bread was at hand. That morning, Jesus and the disciples had gathered together, and he summoned John and me and said, I want you two to go and prepare the place for the Passover celebration tonight. I knew that was a great honor, but it was also a big responsibility. Where would we find a place in all of Jerusalem? I mean, the place was packed. So I asked Jesus if he had a particular location or something in mind. He said, as a matter of fact, I do. Go into the city and find a man carrying a water pitcher on his head. Follow him to the house where he enters and tell the master of the house, the teacher has need of your guest room for the Passover celebration with his disciples. That was not going to be a difficult thing to find because carrying a pitcher of water on one's head was a woman's job. You didn't find men doing that, but we knew exactly where to go. There was a section in Jerusalem that the Essenes lived. The Essenes were a celibate group of men who dedicated themselves to the preservation of the sacred Hebrew writings. They would take care of rewriting or gathering and cataloging all of the scriptures. And they were so dedicated to that, they never married. And so the men took care of all of the responsibilities. And they would take turns going to the well early in the morning to get the water for the day. So we did as Jesus had suggested. We followed the man to his home and went inside, told the master that the teacher wanted this guest room. And sure enough, he had no questions about that. He took us right to a room that was empty on the upper floor. And he said, here, you're welcome to use this room. Well, we've set to work. It took the better part of a day for us to do all of the things necessary, getting all the tables set and covered and all the seating arranged, all the pillows on the floor, getting all the food, making sure we had everything done and the food prepared, and enough of all the things that we needed, the wine and the lamb. We finally finished, and it was time for the disciples to gather. We all gathered together in our respective places around the table. We had done this on 2 other occasions, and so we knew where to sit. And so as the time for the Passover celebration got underway, we were prepared. As we sat there around the table, Jesus said something at the very beginning of the meal he had never said before. He looked at us and said, with fervent desire, I have desired to eat this Passover meal with you before I suffer. For I say to you, I will not eat of this Passover meal again until I eat it in my Father's kingdom. I knew right then this was no ordinary Passover. We proceeded with the celebration, the lighting of the candles, the rituals, the naming of the plagues. Then all of a sudden, Jesus looked at us and he said, tonight, one of you men will betray me to my enemies. I couldn't believe my ears. Did he actually say that one of us would betray him to his enemies? One of us? We loved him. We'd been with him for over 3 years. We would do anything to protect him. And so my curiosity was piqued, and I looked at John, who was sitting at the end of the table next to Jesus. He was on Jesus' right hand, and Judas Iscariot was on the left side of Jesus. And since I was some distance away, sitting at the end of the table, just in case I needed to go out and get anything for the Passover meal, I motioned to John after getting his attention and asked him to ask Jesus what he meant. He leaned over and said something to Jesus. Jesus responded. I could see him talking back to John. I didn't know exactly what he said, but John told me later, he said, "It is he to whom I will give the bread after I have dipped it in the cup." Well, I noticed that he dipped the bread in the cup and handed it to Judas, but I didn't think anything of it at the time. But then he looked at Judas and he said, "What thou do as quickly." Judas got up immediately and went out of the room. He wouldn't return for the duration of the meal. I thought he had gone to see about giving some money to the poor. You see, that was a tradition that we had in that day. Those of us that could afford the preparation of the meal and had a little bit of extra money would give it to those who couldn't afford and help them buy some of the food for the Seder meal. I waited, but he never returned. Later I would learn that it was Judas who was the one who would betray Jesus for 30 pieces of silver, the price of a slave. Judas sold Jesus to his enemies. The betrayal was underway. We continued with the meal. Nothing extra special happened. We got to the third part of the meal, the afikomen, the bread right before the meal. Earlier in the celebration, Jesus had taken the matzah and had broken it in half, wrapping half of it in a linen napkin and burying it away, hiding it. He now brought it forth, and he said to his disciples, those of us that were gathered there, the age-old blessing that had been said for centuries, "Blessed art thou, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who brings forth bread from the earth." And he broke it, and he passed it to his disciples. As we took the bread in our hands as it was passed, Jesus told us that this was his body that was broken and given for us. We knew that he was not talking about his physical body in this bread, but it was a symbol. From this night on, each time we partook of this part of the Passover celebration, we were to remember him, his body broken for us. To be honest, I didn't understand exactly what he was saying at that time, but now I do. He said, "Take, eat, and remember me." He proceeded to that third cup, the cup of redemption. He held it up as he had done on previous occasions, as they had done for centuries, and he blessed it, saying, "Blessed art thou, O Lord our God, King of the universe, creator of the fruit of the vine." And he passed it to his disciples. As he passed it to us, and as we drank from that cup, he said, "Men, this is a new covenant in my blood, which I make with you tonight. Drink all of it and remember me." We knew that this covenant that he was talking about was a covenant of blood. For Leviticus tells us that the life of the flesh is in the blood. And Hebrews says, without the shedding of blood, there is no remission or forgiveness of sin. While we didn't understand at that point the full implication of what Jesus was saying, now I do. It was his blood that paid for our redemption. After he said that, he stopped for a moment and looked at us. He said, tonight, every one of you will forsake me. Well, I couldn't stay silent any longer. I mean, every one of us would betray him, would deny him, would separate ourselves from him. No way. Not me. Now, I can't account for John and James and the other men that were there, but I know myself, and I know my love for him. And there is no way that I would ever forsake Jesus. And I told him so. I said, not me, Lord. You can count on me. He looked straight at me and he said, Peter, tonight, before the rooster crows, you will deny knowing me 3 times. I was speechless. I couldn't believe my ears. He thought I would deny him 3 times before the rooster crowed? He led the group in singing the great Hallel, Psalm 118, but I couldn't sing. I was dumbfounded. I couldn't believe my ears that he thought I could deny him. They finished the hymn and prepared to leave. They blew out the candles of the Passover meal and began to leave. The time of betrayal was underway. The time of accusation had come. We walked out of the upper room, down the steps, across the city, through the narrow streets, winding its way over to the gate, entered the Kidron Valley, down the valley, and up to the Mount of Olives. It was our routine way to go to Bethany, where we would spend the night. In going to Bethany, we always stopped at the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus liked to pray. It was a beautiful spot. As we entered the gate, Jesus told us to stay there at the gate and pray and stand guard. But then he said, James, John, Peter, come with me. And so we went a little deeper with him into the garden. We came to a clearing and he said, men, my heart is deeply troubled. Pray with me. Watch with me while I go yonder and pray to the Father. Would you pray with me here in this place? We all said that we would, and we found a place where we could sit down and get kind of comfortable. Perhaps that was our problem. We got too comfortable. There was a coolness, crispness in the air, and so we brought our cloaks a little closer around us and settled down to pray. We were tired, especially John and I, from the work that we had done in preparation for the meal, and we sat down, the 3 of us, to pray, but with the heavy meal that we had eaten and the fatigue from the day, I'm afraid we fell asleep. I'm not exactly sure how long we slept, but I know that when Jesus came back, he awakened us with a question directed at me. He said, "Simon, are you sleeping? Could you not watch with me for 1 hour?" I was so ashamed. I assumed it had been an hour that Jesus had been praying. We had fallen asleep. He told us that his soul was in agony, and I looked on him and saw an agony and intensity that I'd never seen before. His forehead, his hands, his arms were covered in sweat, drops of blood, as it were. And I'd never seen that kind of intensity. He said that he was going to go back and pray to his Father, and he wanted us to pray and watch with him. And I was determined this time I was going to watch. I was going to pray. I was going to join with him in this vigil. But alas, I fell asleep again, as did John and James. He came to us 3 times in all. Each time, he found us asleep. The last time he came and awakened us, I heard the sound of footsteps coming our way. I immediately awakened, and I realized that Jesus had gone through this vigil alone. The unshared vigil was over. When I awakened, I could hear the clanging of metal against metal and the footsteps of men. I could see the torches coming through the trees. And as they grew closer, I realized that Judas was leading the group. Judas, of all people, what was he doing with these people? With the temple guards and the high priest and the Sadducees and some Pharisees. What was he doing with this group? That's when I realized what he had done. He came up to Jesus and took him by the shoulders and kissed him, first on one cheek and then on the other. Then he stepped aside. Immediately, when he stepped aside, one of the temple guards grabbed Jesus by the arm. I immediately and instinctively drew out my sword and lashed at it, the first person that came near me. I was afraid that they were going to attack us. When I realized what I had done, I had cut off the ear of Malchus, the high priest's servant. He was screaming in agony and pain as blood rushed down his head. Jesus picked up his ear from the ground and placed it back on the side of his head. Immediately the blood stopped and the screaming ceased. Jesus had healed him. I, for one, was afraid for my life, and the rest of them were too, I suppose, because we all ran in different directions. John and I didn't run too far, however. We stayed in the shadows. John had a special affinity for Jesus, and we all loved him, but I was curious. I wanted to see what was going to happen. And so we hid in the shadows. We followed as they led Jesus to the house of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. They took him inside the house, and John went on inside the house with Jesus. You see, he was a friend of the high priest. And since he knew him, he just walked on in the house as he'd done many times before. I stayed in the courtyard. John told me later what had happened. He said that the Sanhedrin had gathered there inside, the 70 rulers of Israel, 70 men who ruled in the affairs, the governmental affairs, the civic affairs of the city. Anything that didn't matter with the Romans, the Sanhedrin took care of. The high priest was the moderator, was the head. And so there were 71 men in all. And John said they try to find some agreement in a charge to lay against Jesus. And they couldn't find any. One would say one thing, one would say something else, and they couldn't find two to agree until finally two men said, "We heard him say with our own ears that if he destroyed the temple, he would restore it in 3 days." Well, we understood when Jesus said that he was talking about his physical body. But they said he was talking about the temple of Herod that had taken many years to build. And so the high priest, according to John, was so enraged that he tore his garment and said, "That's enough. That's blasphemy. This man is worthy of death." And so they brought him outside. While this was going on inside, I, as I said, was out in the courtyard. Early on, one of the young girls there said, "Don't I know you? Aren't you one of his disciples? I believe I saw you in Galilee." I told her, I said, "I'm sorry, you're mistaken. It must have been someone else. It wasn't me. I'm from Galilee, but I haven't spent much time there, and I don't know this man." She seemed to be satisfied, and I thought that was all. Then a little bit later on, from the other side of the courtyard, there was a young girl, and she said, "You are one of his disciples. I saw you in Nazareth with him." I looked at her sternly and I said, "I don't know what you're talking about. I was not with this man. I have not traveled with this man, and I don't know what you're talking about. I do not know him." And I turned and went back to the fire to warm myself. I thought that was it. I had said it clearly enough. I had nothing to do with this man. But one of the men standing there by the fire had heard me speak, and he said, "You are one of his disciples. Your speech betrays you. You're not from Jerusalem. You are one of his disciples." I looked him straight in the eye, and I began to curse and swear, and I said, "I don't know that man. I've never seen him before. I don't know what you're talking about. I just came in here to get some warmth on this chilly night. I have no idea what you're talking about. I don't know him." Just as I said that, the rooster crowed. I turned, and there he was, almost within arm's distance of me. Jesus. He had heard every disgusting word I had just said. He had heard me say that I didn't know him. I didn't know him. After all this time, after all the things that we had been through, and I'd said I didn't know him. Early in our ministry, he said, "Whom do men say that I am?" And I spoke up immediately. "You're the Christ. You're the Son of the living God." He patted me on the back and said, "You've said well, Simon, your name will be Peter. And I'm going to build my church on this revelation of who I am, that I am the Christ, the Son of the living God." And now I betrayed him. Now I denied even knowing him, and I was cursing and swearing that I had nothing to do with this man. I couldn't believe myself. I saw such compassion, such love, such understanding in his eyes. It made it even worse. I turned and I ran as fast as I could down the steps that led out of the courtyard into the city streets, and I almost fell several times going down those steps because of the tears that were in my eyes. I followed at a distance as they led Jesus down those same steps out into the city street and over to Pilate's. While I was there, I kept thinking, why? Why? Why did I deny him? Why did I say I didn't know him? He's my Lord. He's my Master. Why? But I had joined in the time of accusation with Jesus. I followed as they led him on to the Antonia fortress. There, when he reached the fortress where the guards were and the Roman garrison was stationed, he was brought before Pilate. Pilate asked him a series of questions, and he just stood there. One time he did say, "It is as you've spoken," in answer. But Pilate looked at him and he said, "I find no fault in him. I have it examined and I find no reason." The people said, "But he's no friend of Caesar." So Pilate came up with an idea. You see, it was the tradition that every year at Passover, Pilate would release one of the prisoners as a goodwill gesture to the Jewish community. And so he said to them, "Who do you want me to release to you? This Jesus, in whom I can find no fault, or Barabbas, this criminal that we've been looking for years, who has violated so many of you Jews, broken into your homes, stolen from you, murdered you, your friends and your family?" I couldn't believe my ears. Immediately the crowd cried out, "Give us Barabbas! Give us Barabbas!" And Pilate said, "Okay, what do you want me to do with Jesus?" And in unison they said, "Crucify him! Crucify him! Crucify him!" Each time getting louder and louder. Pilate washed his hands of the matter and turned him over to the soldiers for them to abuse. The soldiers began to beat him, the cat of nine tails, until his back was nothing but raw flesh and his chest, blood coming down his body. They put a purple robe back on him, and the agony of that robe, that cloth covering those open wounds. And then they placed a crown of thorns on his head, and the blood just came down his face, trickling down. And they led him off to be crucified. He was so weak from the beatings that he had received and from the lack of sleep that he could barely walk himself, much less carry that heavy crossbeam on his shoulders. He stumbled several times as he went through the narrow streets leading out to the north side of the city. One of the soldiers called for a man from the crowd to come. It happened to be Simon of Cyrene. He told Simon, "You carry his cross." And they dragged Jesus behind. They brought him to the place called Golgotha, the place of the skull, the place of execution. It was a place known to the Jews. It's where they stoned to death their criminals. And the Romans crucified their criminals there at the base of that hill, right at the main street, going out to Jericho. Jesus got to that point, and they thrust him on the ground, stretched out his arms on that crossbeam. They tied his wrist to that crossbeam and began to nail nails through his wrist. The sound of that hammer hitting that spike, first one and then the other, I'll never forget. It still rings in my ears. The horror. Each time that hammer hit, he winced in pain and agony as the nail pierced through nerve endings and sinews. The blood poured out of his wrists. They raised that beam up, put it on the upright portion of the cross, and let it down with a thud, and when it did, he winced in pain even more and cried out because every part of his body was in pain and agony. He crossed his feet over each other and drove a spike through them as well. And there Jesus was. He hung there. And I heard him say, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. Forgive them. He asked for the Father to forgive them for all the cruel treatment he had received. Pilate had a sign printed that said, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. Some of the Jewish leaders didn't like that. They said, put on there, he says he's the King of the Jews. Pilate said, what I have written, I have written. And so they nailed the sign on the cross. Jesus, my master, had been crucified. I watched the noonday sun turned as black as midnight. It was hard to see. It was dark, and Jesus said several things from the cross. 3 hours went by. And all of a sudden, I heard him cry out, Father, it is finished. Into thy hands I commit my spirit. And he died. It was exactly 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I know that because just as I heard those words, the earth began to quake and the lightning in the sky and the thunder, but I could hear off in the distance the blowing of the shofar's horn there at the temple where the priest was blowing the horn saying that the paschal lamb had been slain for the sins of the people. And I watched. Jesus was dead. Those around the cross began to leave, perhaps because he had died, perhaps for fear of the earthquake, and later we were to learn that it even caused the veil in the temple to rend from top to bottom. That veil that separated the Holy of Holies, the presence of God, from the holy place. It was official. Jesus had died. They took him down from the cross. Began the process of removing the body. There was a man who was a secret disciple of Jesus. His name was Joseph of Arimathea. He was a Pharisee. He had gone to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Otherwise, it would have just stayed on the cross until after the Sabbath, and the birds would have come and the vultures and picked at his flesh. Joseph wanted to give him a burial in a tomb that he owned, a tomb that was his own. So they took down the body of Jesus and put him on a linen bed and took him to the garden tomb just right next to Golgotha. The women went to work immediately using the spices and the linen wraps that they had brought with them. Nicodemus, who was another disciple of Jesus, secretly, of course, because he was a Pharisee, he came and brought about 100 pounds of aloes and myrrh with which to anoint the body of Jesus. And so the women worked as hard as they could, wrapping the body and putting a layer of spices, and then wrapping the body and putting some spices, and continuing this process, but they couldn't get it completely finished. They were running out of time. It was almost time for the Sabbath to begin. They did the best they could, but they had to leave. I was standing some distance away from them, hidden in the trees, so they couldn't see me, but I could hear them making arrangements to come back the first day of the week and finish the process of embalming the body. They left, but I couldn't. I was drawn to this man. I couldn't believe that he was dead. As they left, the Roman soldiers rolled a stone in front of the tomb. And there they laid Jesus. Jesus was entombed. It was official. The master, the teacher, is dead and laid in the tomb. May you go in quiet silence and contemplation as you leave tonight and as we await the first day of the week.